Hello, ladies, gentlemen, and everyone in between. Welcome to the 26th Annual Jewish Book Festival for the Jewish Federation of the Greater San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys. This is a special spring event that we're having since the rest of our festival did take place in the fall. I am Rebecca Russell. I am so excited to be here and to welcome you all. This event is a phenomenal opportunity for our community. We are very excited. I'm going to go ahead and tell you a little bit about our um, our Jewish Book Festival, and then a little bit about the person we have coming to speak today. So we are honored to be able to choose many of our authors from the Jewish Book Council, and it is with them that we present many of our authors for our festival. There will be a 2025 Jewish Book Festival that begins in the fall of this year. We were unable to get this particular author for the fall, so we are very thankful that she is available tonight. Let me go ahead and thank our literary circle, without which we would not be able to have many of the events that we have, and our Jewish Book Festival Committee, which chooses all of the authors as well. Um, our amazing author tonight's name is Adrianne Black, born Derek Black, so when you purchase her book, it will have her born name on it. She is a writer and former white supremacist and member of the Ku Klux Klan, was meant to be the heir apparent. We are very excited to hear more about her story as she presents to us her book, The Klansman Son. Please welcome Adrianne Black.
Hi, Rebecca. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks so much to the entire organization and also everyone who has come tonight. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak virtually and any chance that we have to come together. I think it has been a real gift. This was a book. I have a copy of it for people who are interested. This was a book that really I did not expect to write for many, many years. My experience of condemning my family's ideology is now 12 years ago, and that was a dramatic moment in my life, and it was not really one that I initially saw any path afterwards. It was one that I sort of had to keep pushing forward without any real expectation that I had much of a meaningful future. And even after that changed, even which was many years, several years into that experience, I realized that I could no longer stay silent. I had written publicly condemning the movement, but I had also tried to just never speak publicly again. And that also turned out to be an unconscionable choice. And even then, I spent many, many years speaking publicly and working with other people, but this wasn't a book that I thought that I would write up until the 2020 election, actually. So it feels like very odd to be living in the aftermath of the 2024 election and all the time that I thought about this book and put it out. And it contains my thoughts and experiences and the things that I think I've taken from my life, but it also is something that I think is so deeply based in the communities and in the conversations that I've had throughout my life. And so I've really found that now that I've put it out, coming up on a year from now, it's about 10 months ago, I really find that these kind of conversations are the most meaningful way and the most useful way to sort of share these things, and I am really open to conversation afterwards. So people who might have questions coming up, I'd like you to really think about them and put them out there because the whole experience of my life is one that is so completely framed around personal relationships and conversations and just asking myself and existing with people who ask themselves, like, who were they? What were their values and what did they want in the world? And I think that we sort of co-construct the world together. I don't if there's nothing else that people take from my life and my experiences, I hope that the one lesson is that individual relationships are the most important thing. We tend to underestimate them. We tend to imagine that when we talk to somebody, that's some insignificant action, but really the entire world has changed and moved and run on this. And most of the time, unlike with my friends, we don't know what the ultimate results are of the conversations that we have. So, with that, I would like to just do a hopefully relatively compact and concise version of the life experiences that I have, because this is a memoir. It's one it's pretty chronological. It starts the first quarter of it or so happens before I was born, looking at my family's formation really within the Nazi movement, within the international white supremacist movement in the 1960s, and then me joining my parents fairly late in their careers. They had already, by the time that I was born, my family had already spent decades, over 30 years, building the white nationalist movement. They had formed it in many ways in their own image, although they weren't the only people, they were just really significant ones. Starting from when they were teenagers, they'd all met in the 1960s, coming from different environments, but all relatively middle class, relatively average. Like most of their family had gone to college, they always had enough money and a place to live and food and school. All both my parents went to college. My experience takes place in college of really coming to terms with the need to condemn my family's ideology. And I just want to say, sort of at the beginning, that going to college wasn't unusual. It was listening, being very open, and actually caring about the people around me that turned out to be very unusual. And so when I was born, my family had already joined the Nazi movement in the 1960s that had formed in opposition to the civil rights movement, that it had already existed for about 15 years in a very conscious way as this social movement that was specifically opposed to the civil rights movement. It's different from just xenophobia or racism or anti-Semitism. It's a movement that created an ideology largely based around Nazism, but it's one that tried to bring together all of the different white supremacist ideologies in the United States and internationally under one banner. They called it different things. White nationalism was what my family named it, but it was also called white power. It was also called white resistance. It was this idea of a movement that could stitch together a bunch of different white supremacist and anti Semitic ideas and form a social movement that they believed nothing less than was going to be lead to a revolution. Even from the time of the 1960s, they were talking about decades in the future having a revolt against the government, against governments across the world, and replacing it with this racial nation. They believe that every race in the world is biological and is inherited, and that it predicts everything about people, how creative they are, how intelligent they are. They have this worldview that is essentially like a 19th century biological one, and they tell themselves with all evidence to the contrary that everything about a person can be predicted by what race they are, and they think that everybody in the world needs to be segregated, and they believe that if they package their message right, they could form a mass movement. The aspect I think that, perhaps this audience might also be especially interested in, but depending on who I'm talking to, I often have to emphasize it more so than, and people are kind of unexpected, or don't expect it, is how central anti-Semitism was to the white power movement. I think it's to the degree that it's not possible to even imagine this movement without its foundation of anti-Semitic conspiracies. The My family believes, more more than almost anything, more firmly and more passionately than they believe almost anything, that every Jewish person in the world is involved in a mass conspiracy to promote immigration and civil rights and anti-racism, in all majority white countries. Like that is just the fundamental belief. They believe every Jewish person in the world is involved and is aware and gets together and has this like plan. And it's not so different from just about any wild conspiracy, but it's one that I think has a lot of different forms. And I think people are aware it's not just white supremacy that uses anti Semitism, but white supremacy, I think, works with it much more hand in glove than I think almost any other ideology because really it's best, I think, to understand anti Semitism as a form of racism. They're not fundamentally different things. And it's not for this talk, but academically, I study the history of racism, and you really can't understand the rise of racism as an idea, like race as an idea, without anti-Judaism existing in the West before that. The whole idea of race and racism is founded on the idea of anti-Semitism, and so while it functions slightly differently, the way that it works, the way that it shapes people's worldviews, I think the reason anti-Semitism fuels the white nationalist movement is because it's a type of racism that's incredibly flexible, fluid, and able to exist in different contexts around the world. So that comes to my life. This is the opening of the book, is like sort of that history that I try to emphasize because it's not the case that I'm like coming in as a historian and I am a academic historian coming in and like just writing some history. To understand the white nationalist movement, you have to understand that they know this history. They believe this history. To be a white nationalist is to just say that you are. It's not a membership organization. It's deeply decentralized, very intentionally, because the line between mass violence and political campaigns is impossible to identify. There is no line. It is a movement that is revolutionary, and it's one that therefore is not structured like the NRA or something. It is a social movement where people know that they're white nationalists because they know the martyrs and the heroes and the history, because they marry each other, because they meet each other, because they subscribe to the same publications. It's a social movement that's probably a lot like others, and so I hope that the way I describe it in this book can maybe even shed light on the way some other radical movements function. And when I was born, my parents, I think, didn't quite expect me. My dad had founded the largest white power website, the first white power website in the world. My mother first married David Duke in college when they met. David Duke, who himself went on to run and successfully lead elections in Louisiana, where he ran as a former Klansman and a former Nazi and still won in Louisiana. He ran for governor and senator in the early 90s and didn't win, but got a majority of the white vote in both elections. And the three of them had just been close friends. They'd been the closest allies and uh, best friends throughout their lives from the time that they met when they were teenagers. And my mother and David were initially married, and my two sisters are from that marriage. And then when my mother got divorced a few years later, she had married my dad. And I came into this movement that it was very clear that they had this passion, that they had built up their lives around the idea that everything that they had done, the sense that they had like sacrificed, that they had led lives where they weren't able to have regular jobs, where they weren't able to sort of exist in the world in a normal way, that they were, sacrificing something while their middle class families thought that they were insane. I grew up with my grandparents sort of yelling at my parents for being public Nazis. They would just tell them not that racism was bad, but that you can just live in a segregated neighborhood without being an outspoken Nazi. And the thing that marked my family and all radicals, I think, was this moral certitude, the sense that if the racism that they had grown up with was true, they couldn't just be passive about it. They had to follow it to some kind of moral and logical end, and so they committed their lives to it. And growing up, I remember seeing leaders of the white nationalist movement coming to the House. We had politicians who had been elected to European Parliament coming to talk shop. We traveled the country going to white nationalist conferences that I think probably don't look like what people might expect. Uh, my dad had founded and then left the Klan before I was born, not because he didn't agree with the ideology anymore, but because he thought the branding didn't work. And so what I was seeing were people wearing suits and ties and pencil skirts and listening to lectures from professors who had waited until they were tenured to declare what raging white supremacists they were, talk about their supposed reality of race. And I would go to dinner with these people when I was an adolescent and a teenager and just spend all this time trying to argue my way into justifying that I hadn't just grown up with this belief system, that I was trying to find my own facts. I listened to all these experts. And so by the time that I was a teenager, I had already started giving interviews on behalf of white nationalism from the time that I was a little kid with my dad, and then increasingly independently. Before I went to college, I ran for office in South Florida where I was growing up, and I won the election for a little seat, a little county seat, in the same year that Barack Obama won the presidency the first time. And and it was really that that catapulted my experience from being one where I was the child of my parents. I was posting on their website. I had started an online radio network. I was organizing conferences and giving speeches and helping other people give speeches and doing media trainings. But it was really that election that put me in this position of being in the New York Times myself. I became like locally famous, and it became just this feeling of inevitability that I was going to inherit this movement. I was going to take on the mantle that my family had tried to build for so many decades. And it was also really clear to me that it didn't feel good, but that wasn't enough to dismiss it. That was something by that point that I had really convinced myself that I had enough arguments and facts that the world may not be how I would like it to be, because I did want to be somebody who was open to others, but that couldn't change the facts that I knew. And then that was the moment when I went to a liberal arts college in Florida. It was a public liberal arts college, which is an unusual quality. It had 800 students. It was in Florida. It had low in state tuition. And I could go there to study the Middle Ages. And my experience of it, knowing it was a very liberal school, was that it would be sort of a break. It would be like a few years where I could lean into the parts of myself that I think felt a little bit more like me, that felt like I could just be curious. I could be curious about other people and about the past and about books and about writing essays and arguments and sort of existing in a campus. And I really underestimated exactly how much it would affect me. It would, how what a difference it would be to no longer be living at home, to no longer be withdrawing at the end of the day. My family had homeschooled me from the time that I was ended 3rd grade, and so while I always thought that I was open to people, I could always go home at the end of the day. I could always, say that I was close friends with somebody, but then hold them at arm's length and then retreat without having too much trouble really examining what it was that I was doing, what kind of life I was trying to divide myself into. So when I showed up at this college, I didn't tell people my background. I didn't think I was lying exactly, but I just didn't bring it up. And nobody Googled me. And so I spent the first semester there with people getting to know me, and me getting to know them, meeting a lot of people who I rapidly realized were the victims of white nationalism, were the people who uh, did understand me. They did know me without knowing what I was keeping from them. And so it became clear that when they found this out, I didn't know how to tell them, but like when they found this out, it was going to be very clear that I couldn't hide behind the idea that they, like, didn't know me. They didn't they thought I was something else. Like, they knew I was supposedly a good friend, and they were also about to find out that I was still advocating an ideology that said they didn't belong in the country on AM radio with my dad. And that is what happened the 2nd semester. I was studying abroad, and I remember watching all these email threads just, uh imploding around me because this was an 800-person school, and everybody sort of knew everybody else, and then watching thousands of messages about what people were gonna do about me, it felt familiar in some ways. I'd spent my life getting hate mail and doing interviews and talking, seeing messages about people who are angry about what my family believed. But this felt very different because I knew these people. And so I was going to come back to campus because I knew I couldn't run away. But I also knew that as weird as it felt, as bad as it felt, as awful as it felt to be this person reflected in the eyes of my friends, it also I meant that I couldn't just like abandon my worldview. And I know I've talked to some people who I think look at it and say, "Oh, I just would have, like, not believed it anymore. I would've just said, 'Whatever, I don't do this anymore.'" But, like, it wasn't how I felt. It felt like I think looking back that I maybe wanted something else, but it was not something that I knew how to walk myself out of. And so I came back to campus. It was wholly changed. People gave me the middle finger in the library. I couldn't walk around without hostility. I tried to go to a party early on. I got surrounded by people. It felt like maybe I would just go to class and kind of exist off campus until one guy, Matthew, invited me to his weekly Shabbat in his dinner in his dorm room, where and they were dinners that were most of the people who attended weren't even Jewish. It was like people coming for a home cooked meal, and I knew him and he knew me, and I think that context is very important. That we're not like random strangers. My story has been told a few times in different places, and I worry sometimes about it taking the form of like invite a Nazi to dinner and you'll show them by kindness to change their mind. And I don't think that's how people work. In my situation, I think was much closer to existing in a social framework, existing in a friend group, having a bunch of people in common, and just being kind of shocked about what this person in your life was saying and doing, and knowing that there were a lot of people who were condemning me, and it wasn't his temperament. He was not going to be out protesting or organizing sit-ins. And so his sense of what could he do was, invite me once at least. And he kind of hoped, I think, to talk to me about my beliefs, but I was incredibly avoidant and we ended up just talking about everything else. I brought kosher wine and it was awkward and weird to not talk about it, but we also became closer and closer friends as I came week to week. And he committed to the idea that just the confrontation of even coming to these dinners would be enough. But other people there were, specifically people who were not Jewish, who were not students of color, were feeling like their obligation over time was to feel right with themselves, like that they were not going to just make me feel comfortable and not bring this up. And it was in that context, like outside of the Shabbat, that I ended up having these conversations that essentially started out with like, would you explain to me what it is you believe? And then me thinking, yes, I'm a public advocate for this belief system, and then realizing in the practice of doing that that I had never actually explained what I believed to somebody who was not a journalist or someone who wanted to join it. And what proceeded to go on for the next couple of years at college was sitting both with the feelings, the fact that I didn't want to be someone who, on one hand, claimed to be a good friend to people around me, and on the other, was so committed to my family's ideology that I would deny the obvious ways that it hurt them, that there was no misunderstanding. I was just too afraid to speak up for what really mattered to me and to really choose what really mattered to me. And then on the other hand, it was all these conversations where we would debunk the stupid things that the professors had said because race is not a worldview that holds up to any kind of statistical or biological scrutiny. It's like not uh, there aren't categories of humans that are called race. These things have so much more overlap between them than any sort of distinctions, and every quality of every supposed race in the world exists within the current modern population of people in Africa today, who have much greater genetic diversity than anyone else. And so you can go through these kind of arguments, but it was like sitting with them, thinking about them, sort of accepting them allowed me to say, okay, yeah, I didn't have any facts supporting this belief system. And I also knew it was wrong morally. And it was only at that moment, and this is where I want to kind of come to the conclusion of this because this is the point that I really hope people take away from this book. Uh, was coming to that place where I knew there was nothing right about it in any sense of the word, and yet I still didn't want to condemn my family's beliefs. I didn't want to abdicate from it. I hadn't posted on my dad's website in 2 years. I hadn't called into his radio show. I hadn't gone to his conferences. They knew I was withdrawing, but it was a different thing to declare that I condemned their belief system, that I was not a part. My identity was not to be a part of them. And it eventually became clear that that was the only moral choice, but looking at the fact that I didn't wanna do that, even though it was clearly right, even though I had patiently walked through all the facts, I knew what I believed, showed me that what probably would have been obvious all along, what people had told me my whole life, that, just indoctrinated into a belief system. That's sort of how it works when you're raised by an ideological family, at least for me, and not necessarily everybody. But realizing that that belief system, not just for me, but for my family, for everybody within the social movement of white nationalism, and largely for people in any social movements or ideologies, our beliefs function as a way to tie us together. Our beliefs function as a way to define our identities within the communities of other people. And so for me, condemning their beliefs was inevitable, was obvious. It was the only choice I had, but it was not one that felt liberating or good. It felt like walking off into a void. It felt like losing my identity. It felt like near to something like dying because it meant losing every relationship that I had formed for the first 21 years of my life, and that felt like losing my own sense of myself. And this is a story about my life and a particular experience that I had in my life, but what I hope people really take from it is that it anybody can change their minds. This isn't really the challenge. The challenge is that people only change their minds when they are first taken in and find themselves as a part of a community that expands their beliefs, that expands the circle of people who they care about. And it's in that process that we end up having to sort of reconcile, like, what do we believe? How does it compare to what other people believe? And where are the sort of misconceptions and where are the ways that we really need to examine who we are in relation to other people? And so, in summary, I think I just want to say that this is true of any ideological movement, and it's true of uh, my life in particular. That if you can just tell me who you care about, who you love, who the circle of people who you would care if you found out that they were saying, "Oh, you've changed," that will be exactly the same thing as saying, "What is it that you believe? Who are you in the world?" And it's when those 2 things become in conflict that we really experience what we often, after the fact, call persuasion, call changing our minds, and you can sort of flip that around and say, in order to help people to change their minds about things, people don't always have to change their minds. My life was a much more extreme case than most. You don't wanna come at it with, like, "I'm gonna give you the best facts, and I'm gonna hammer them over your head." You have to come at it from the point of view of, "Who am I to you, and what is the relationship that we have with each other and with the people around us?" And it's that conversation that leads to real change, and I think that's what I mean by saying that individual relationships are the thing that really drives our world, drives our reality, and they change things more than anything else really can. And so thank you for sitting through and listening to this long story of my travails.
That's absolutely amazing, Adrian. I think we can all agree that it takes an incredible human being to be able to look at themselves and change a bias that you've had since you were a child. I mean, that's one of the hardest things I think for human beings to do is to look at themselves and go, "Oh wait, maybe I was wrong, or maybe this was wrong, or maybe I just got the wrong information," and come out and say it. And I think it's not only incredibly brave, what you've done, to realize the mistakes of generations of white nationalists, but to do exactly what you said, take all those people that you love and know that you're going to be saying and doing stuff that could hurt them, could separate you from them, could distance you from them. And I know that our families are a very important thing in all of our lives, and being a part of our friends and family are very important in all of our lives. So what you've done is not just brave. I mean, it's world changing what you've done, and I hope you're getting the appreciation from other sides that are telling you how incredible it is what you've done, and just thanking you over and over again for being willing to talk about it, because it is such a personal journey that you've gone on. So it's incredibly impressive to me as a as another human being. We do have a question in the Q&A. Before we get started in that, though, I do have a question as well. If you did not notice in the chat, I did mention if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A module. The chat has been disabled for our attendees, so if you have questions, we won't see it if you put it in the chat, but we will see it if you. I'll be able to see it if you put it in the Q&A. I'd like to phrase some of these questions. We do have about 15 to 20 minutes to do the questions, and I think this is going to be even just as important as what you just presented to us, because this is the part where we get to talk about how do we affect change? How do we help others to move forward? And how do we keep spaces safe in the current world and political climate that we're sitting in? So this is going to be an important next 15 to 20 minutes. I hate to put too much importance on it, but I think it really will be, is hearing your personal story and then getting your feedback on your thoughts on it, having been a person who has gone through it themselves, with the understanding to the audience that it is a personal journey. So we can't expect that everybody would have similar realizations or experiences that Adrianne had to put them in a situation to be able to reflect in that same way. So just understand that Adrianne may have insight into her own journey, but she cannot say for sure what others would do. She can merely advise us on what she has seen work. So I want to put that out there to everybody asking questions, to be very fair. I know me as someone who I would consider myself one of the most liberal people I've met. I'm very much love everybody for who they are. Even if their words are not the kindest, let's still show them love and patience and grace. Saying that, reading your book, especially in the beginning, everything seemed so reasonable. I mean, being a white nationalist sounds so reasonable. Oh, we are merely wanting to protect the white race. We're wanting to make sure that we are not losing our heritage. It's really, I mean, just the idea of white nationalism, until I read your book, never seemed so reasonable to me. And I'm reading it going, okay, I can actually see why there are people in the world who believe this without seeing the other side. And it was shocking to me to be able to read your book, and as liberal as I am in my brain and going, white nationalism, how could people do that? That seems insane to me. And it was so reasonable. It is so reasonable if you're brought up in a culture that really looks at it that way, that you, like you said, they had people of great learning, they had incredibly powerful people that are running leadership positions, saying these things, and you go, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. So my first question to you is, do you get a lot of people that are on the cusp, that, or not you, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say you because you're not part of the white nationalist movement anymore, but do you feel like they get a lot of people that are on the cusp, that hearing it sounds so reasonable, it's so easy for them to jump into, oh yeah, I absolutely believe that, just as you described, sort of your parents got really into it after trying the other side, trying the liberal side. It made more sense to them based on their own experience that white nationalism was the way. So could you speak on that for just a moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a really good point. Also, I'll caveat the reason of I hope people don't take that the book is like a reasonable, but
No, no.
from the perspective of nobody thinks they're the villain. Like everybody believes stuff for reasons. Everybody thinks that their worldview is very sound. You know, it one, we don't have to believe things are correct to understand that people like are not raging insane people to believe their things. And so I do think there's like that's a really good question because the point of one of the points I think of like even describing what it means to be within the white nationalist movement, like what these people's lives are like, is the fact that I think it's different what than what most people see. Like I mentioned the conferences where everybody's, wearing business clothes and going to banquets and listening to tenured professors talk, which I don't think most people, it's not what they expect. And you can also sort of see how that crowd could look around and see everybody being so refined and say, "Oh, they call us ignorant bigots. Look at how refined we are. We're so different. They don't understand us." And the other side of it is like being a very public white nationalist. Like my family had that experience throughout their lives, and I had it as a young person, and then for several years as a like before college as a young adult, where people just recognized me in the street. I could not go anywhere without being recognized as like the future of the white nationalist movement in South Florida, and that experience was very uh, I mean, positive isn't the right word, but like praise from strangers. People who are not white nationalists would come up and like buy my tab at a coffee shop or buy dinner. Like I remember whenever I'd go to Louisiana and visit David Duke, if he had a tendency to speed. He really liked to drive really fast, and every time he'd get pulled over, you just had to wait for the cop to get to the door, see him, realize who he was, and go like, "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, Mr. Duke. Just please go on your way." And then they go get back in their car. This experience of like being a public white nationalist is like seeing very regular white people all around you, uh, feeling relieved, like feeling like they could be afraid, they could be against immigration, they could be anti-black, they could be just, racist, and find a community of people where they didn't have to worry about being criticized or worry about changing their lives or worry about re-examining the world around them. Like there's a lot of people in the world who just look at the inequality in the world and really want to have a conclusion that they don't need to feel like responsible for changing it, that they could just look around and see massive inequality and say, well, that's the way the world is, maybe it's supposed to be that way, maybe it's fine. And that is really the root of why racism, white supremacy, and just white nationalism in general has any kind of purchase. It's not because they've come up with the best arguments. It's not be like all their stuff falls apart if anybody wants to, ponder it. It's not like good arguments, but it does have the benefit of telling people they don't have to do anything. They don't have to be ashamed of anything that's happened in their lives. They don't have to worry about uh, living in a society where how much wealth you have and how you're going to be treated by the police is like predicted by what caste you're born into. It's an awful thing to think, and people don't like it. And some people answer that by putting in their ideological hat with civil rights, with anti-racism, and then a lot of people, like more than I think some people are willing to acknowledge, just want to say this isn't my responsibility and maybe you're the one who's wrong and maybe the world should be this way. And I think there's a real way of seeing white nationalism and white supremacy is not like proactive raging hate, but as just a sort of
It's passive.
like a passive acceptance.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's also it's a form of privilege. I mean,
Hmm.
many people in the United States especially are quite privileged if we are white passing or if we look, cisgender, white passing. I'm trying to think of what else, male, all of those things. There is a privilege associated with that's been created in the United States up to this point, and that didn't happen by accident. There are people behind that. It's a strong methodology that has led us to this. And I think more and more we're realizing that people would prefer to just be passive and go, you know what? It doesn't affect me negatively. It's fine. It's
Hmm.
fine. I'm around a bunch of people who also sort of think this, and I don't really have to, examine it. I don't have to look at what it could or couldn't be. I'm being told by people around me, like you're saying, that this is correct. And so I don't have to examine it. I don't have to be ashamed for mistakes I may have made. It's everybody else's fault or it's those people's fault. They can point a finger. It is a passive form of privilege, I
Mm.
feel like.
No, no,
It's
for sure.
it's
I
fascinating.
I I I was very insistent on putting in the book also sort of like 16th century history because, I like history. I think everybody hopefully can get something out of history, but I think it's one of those sort of, important things that I don't think many white supremacists ever like to deal with, but I think a lot of people don't really know what to do with the fact that like race is just a intentionally constructed system. It's not like people came to these random conclusions and then they just built these identities. Like race didn't exist until the concept of it was put into law. You had like people who had different, skin tones or whatever in North American society, but the idea of race didn't exist in any form until it was created as a legal status, where like of taking privilege, like literal privileges away from people. I think sometimes when we talk about like white privilege, I'm not sure that anybody understands what we're saying when we say that. Like, the first creation of race is just like legally saying what you fall into a certain category. What legal privileges do you have? Do you have the right to bring a lawsuit against somebody? If you fall into the black race, you do not. If you fall into the white race, you do. And when you create these social categories, the first generation of them, everybody just thinks it's completely random. And then the second generation, they just sort of accept that that's the way the world is. And then the third generation, like, talks about it like it's the most fundamental aspect of their identity they've ever heard of in their lives.
It's always existed. Why would we question it, right? Yeah, right? It's like by the 3rd and the ongoing generations, it's like, that's just how it is. That's
Mhm.
just correct.
Yeah, and so
Yeah,
talking about race is like not it's saying race is a social construct. I think is another thing we don't quite you know always know what we mean when we say that. It's like race is real because it affects people's lives. Like this is a real identity. It's a real thing that structures and predicts stuff about how society is going to treat us. It's not real in the like genetic blood way, but it's real in the way that our world is shaped by it. And so I think that that's also something you might be surprised. And I never mean to call anyone out with this, but one of the most like common conversations I have after talks where we do them in person is somebody who wants to come up and who disagrees with the idea that race is like not a biological category. They even if they consider themselves sort of egalitarian, they'll come up and they'll be like, well, I don't know, but it does seem to predict things about people. And we'll have this like little discussion about, and it always sort
Oh,
of
like genetic you mean genetic predictors? Is that what you mean?
yeah, I mean,
Like that
whatever
kind of thing?
whatever it is
Mm,
that they mean, they just think like, it's
yeah.
just like a more common belief. I think racism is more insidious and less like in your face terror than we tend to imagine. Like most racism is fairly banal.
Yeah. I mean, I would actually agree with that. I think that's fascinating. I mean, it goes through the age-old debate: is Judaism a culture, a race, a religion? I mean, what is Judaism itself? I asked that as a member of the Jewish Federation. So that's an age-old debate, which I will not force you to get into right now, as that is not your expertise. So I will not ask you to get into that. But I mean, I think that is fascinating. I sort of want to follow the same journey and questions as you followed your journey in life. So, following that, just sort of the idea of how reasonable, when in reading the beginning of your book, how it seems, so reasonable. It obviously is not. You're right. The argument falls apart as soon as you start to really get into facts and have to analyze the actuality of it. I want to talk about. I read an interview a while ago from the New York Times, I think 2017, which I'm not going to ask you to remember what you said then. I'm gonna I'm gonna bring it up. So it talks a little bit about um, maybe it was a 2017. Maybe that's a different interview I was looking at. It talked a little bit about you being in school and then your parents taking you out to homeschool, right? And understanding that that happens a lot in the white nationalist movement. Do you feel like that they are the parents are afraid that their children will be learning the liberal side, or afraid that they're going to be learning I'm gonna go say this, I'm sorry, a more educated side. Um, and that's why they tend to pull their children out of schools. Are they afraid that their kids are going to get bullied by the people as you experienced in college? What is the reasoning you think that a lot of white nationalist children and people of the white nationalist movement pull their children out to homeschool them instead of
Mm.
sending them into the public school system?
I mean, I think it's definitely not at least it's explicitly because they want their kids to be less educated. Like, they think that they're
Okay.
gonna be more like most homeschoolers, do believe that. They think they're gonna, give their kids so much better education, and in my case, it was, kind of strange unschooling, and, like, it's amazing that that I was educated at the end of it. It was, like, self-directed. It was not it's a
Mm,
very, very strange kind of schooling life. Uh, but it's the same reason I think that most people who homeschool I mean, honestly, I'll just say like most people who homeschool are doing it for some kind of ideological reason. And that ideological reason is like they don't want to see their kids learn and embrace an ideology or a way of seeing the world that is different from theirs, and they're very aware that their ideology is very different. That's why you get so many religious groups that homeschool their kids. It's because they are terrified of the idea of their kids going to school and then coming back and saying that they've adopted a worldview that's like different, or views their parents' worldview as like wrong or backward, and it's just like a terrifying idea. I think probably not just to white nationalist parents, like to a lot of parents in a lot of ways, and some people are more accepting of this than others. But I think there's some level of like fear of your kid coming home with an opinion that is like holds you negatively, and that's what leads a lot of parents to homeschool. It's what led my parents to homeschool. There's the stories they told themselves where it was like, safer for me not to be in a multiracial school, or like I would have a better education if I was able to, read books on my own time rather than some kind of like curriculum they thought wasn't very good. Like the sort of justifications they gave, but I think the explanation of like you just don't want to see your kid believe that you're wrong, and that's like a fear that some parents cannot get over.
that's a great answer. I think that's absolutely true. Moving along your personal journey and your parents as well. I think it's important. I feel like our family and the people who bring us up are a huge part of the journey you personally had, but I think that's everybody's journey. For the first part of our lives, it is mostly our friends and family that are raising us, that are giving us our experiences. When you decided to go to New College, it is a liberal arts college, and I wonder because you state in the interview that I was talking about, actually, you state that had you gone to a larger school, it's entirely possible you may not have made this major change in your ideology because you would have possibly found other people at a larger school that had your same ideology that you could sort of ignore more the anger and frustration that you were getting from many of the students at New College.
Mm.
That if you were at a larger school, you wouldn't have seen that. Do you think, had you gone to a larger school, do you feel that you might have stayed within the white nationalist movement? A. And B, did your parents support you going to New College, possibly for that reason? Thinking if they kept you out of the larger school, you would get similarly the similar homeschooling experience of really specific ideologies.
Mm. I mean, explicitly, my parents were, sort of remarkably, especially my dad was, sort of remarkably uh, willing to allow me to make my choices. I had this sort of strange dichotomy that I kind of started examining more when I was writing this book. This feeling that, I gave my first public interview with him when I was 10 years old. And, it's easy to look at that and say, like, oh, it's like he's like a stage parent or something. But,
Right.
as a 10-year-old, I felt incredibly independent. He legitimately did ask me over and over again, did I want to do this interview? And I said yes. And so, uh, you know, when I look back on it, I'm like, what do 10-year-olds know? You can't just like ask your 10-year-old to consent to some. There's a reason we don't let 10-year-olds consent to a lot of things.
Right.
It's not how this works. And so now I look back on it, I think it's incredibly strange and naive. But like on the other hand, he really did believe that he was focusing on my own independence, like focusing on what I wanted. I have, a lot of examples of this. Like my family were anti-vaccine, But
Mm.
I remember being like a 6-year-old and them asking me if I wanted to have the polio vaccine because it was optional, and me saying, "No, I don't
Like a
want."
6-year-old could possibly know that,
Yeah,
right?
and I based my decision on it was this sort of, like, polio vaccine you had to drink. I don't think kids even get this anymore, but and I thought it was gross, and so I said no, and he was like, "Well, my child has spoken, I'm not gonna have the polio vaccine." And it was this
Yeah.
kind of, like, parenting that explicitly argued, the child should be able to decide for themselves and you should, listen to the will of your child. And it's such a contradiction also to growing up in an ideological family that like, he could say that, but that basically amounted to the fact that he knows what's right and wrong. He has a whole understanding of the entire world and every aspect of it and the conspiracies that run it. And it's very important that his child think through and come to my own conclusions that oh yeah exactly come to my own conclusions. And I could accept that, he was, like, ready to accept that I could make terrible choices. I could believe something horrible and evil, but, like, it was important that I decide that, It's like this, like, strange contradiction, and I think that played out up until college. Like, he wasn't gonna tell me I couldn't go to a liberal arts college, and also everybody in my family had gone to some kinda, like, liberal college because every college from their perspective was liberal, and so I was,
Oh,
like, going there, thinking that I wasn't afraid of my beliefs being challenged because, I thought I believed things not because I hadn't been exposed, but because I, had come to these rigorous. I believe that, I had lived in a world that had been telling me it was wrong, that my ideology that my family had taught me was so wrong that I had already like had everybody in the world tell me I was wrong. It didn't matter if some people at school did too.
yeah. It is really I hear a lot of your thankfulness to your parents despite what their beliefs are in your book. I mean, you seem to have an adult awareness, obviously looking back on it, that your parents were trying to either protect you, support you, give you options. You're right, a 6-year-old cannot know the answer to that. A 10-year-old cannot know the answer. A 7-year-old cannot know the answer for themselves. This is my daughter, by the way. She came in. I
Hello.
specifically told her not to come during this, and she did because that's what children do.
That's
Um,
appropriate.
right? It is to come in right during this part of the conversation.
Mhm.
It is amazing that your parents wanted to give you bits of autonomy. Because I think the image that we get is of, very strict parents, the idea that, parents would, very controlling over their children's lives. I think we get that as a stereotype or an image of the, white nationalist movement. So I think it's really phenomenal that your parents within that are, trying to give you the way to make your own path. And we're not going to get too personal on that level because I know you do try to keep some things personal in your life as you are a very public figure. So I will just say for the audience that the next question is, how is Adrienne connected with her parents now? I
Yeah.
can say that you do seem to have a very basic relationship with your parents. They have not
Mhm.
abandoned you. They seem to be very much. It's about they love their child, even if their child's ideologies they think may be incorrect. Um, I can let you speak to that yourself, but I have, done a bunch of read and watched a bunch of interviews of you, and I think it's really phenomenal for your parents, despite feeling very strongly the opposite of what you're saying, um, that they still love you and they still
Yeah.
care for you as their child. I think that's really important for people to see that dichotomy can exist, that you can still love your children despite them disagreeing with you. Because I am terrified that she will have, exactly as you said, different ideologies than what I want her to have, but she is her own person and she does get to decide those things for herself when she's old enough. So
Right.
uh, the answer to the question is, and I'll let you answer it, but I'm sorry, the question itself is, does Adrian have any connection with her family now?
Yeah.
Does
I
she?
I mean, it so I condemned their worldview, like, almost 12 years ago now, and it was not clear at that point that they were going to be able to maintain any kind of connection, and they debated it for a week, whether they wished I hadn't been born or whether they could, like, continue it, and so you can, like, kind of imagine, and like, now looking back on it, I'm more resentful. I feel like it's a bit self-centered, sort of debate whether you can stay connected to your child even though they don't believe your ideology. But they did make that
Yeah.
choice, and it's been incredibly tense. We've never spoken where they have not, gone on a tangent rant about how I believed evil things and I was on the wrong side of history and ideology, and it was it's a very, like, tense, sometimes feels kind of shallow almost relationship because it's so focused on, "Do you believe what I believe?" And it seems like that's one of the least interesting human questions. But, so we have this, and as I get older, I kinda, like, say, "Yes, I think it's important that we maintain that ability to connect," but I think, as I get older, I'm more aware of the fact that, like, being able to speak is not the same thing as, maintaining, like, some sort of, like, understanding of each other, and, I feel like it's often been kinda one-sided, me trying to understand them, and so I'm a little bit impatient with them at this point.
Which you may have the right to be at this point.
Well, we all have the
Station
right to, make our
that's
choices,
true.
but, like,
That's true, it's very true. Well, this is gonna be the very last question, that we have, in the Q&A, and that is, oops, let me adjust this. Ooh, that's a little loud, sweetheart. Can you take that to the other room, please? Too loud. Can you take it to the other room, please?
the sound
Thank
isn't
you.
coming through, but whatever it is.
Oh, good. She's opening a bag of chips.
Okay. This is for me.
So final question, and it has to do, and I have so many more questions for you, of course, but it has to do with how you ended your beautiful presentation, and that is, now that you have become a strong advocate against hate, uh, can you give us any more advice when we find in our own lives, whether it be friends or family, that have very opposing views to us? Do you have any advice on how to move forward in a way to either keep or decide to let go of a relationship, or to move forward in a fair discussion?
Right. I mean, I think I do. I think it's, there are some sort of, like, general principles there, and I hope people take away from my experience that, like, you can't, force somebody to change their mind. It's like how no human relationship works that way. It's even kind of, I think, talking to people who knew me in college, their opinion was that it would have been kind of arrogant to say, "Oh, I'm going to force you to change your mind." Like, you can't. You're not really somebody's friend if that's your position. Like, I'm gonna. It's almost like you're trying to trick them or something. And so you can't assume that, but what you can do is ask, like, "Who am I to you? Are we in good faith? Do you listen to me when I talk? Like, do I listen to you when you talk?" And those kind of questions are the ones that we can understand as, like, human questions, where you can't walk around, beating people over the head with better ideas and have them go, "Oh my god, I can't believe you've changed my life. You told me something is true, and I was believing false things." But what you can do is, like, be a person in their life, and if you care about them and they care about you, maintaining that connection while also saying, like, "I know you, I love you, I care about you, I understand you, and I also am just, like, kind of horrified about what you believe," is a very powerful thing. I'm not sure there's anything that's, like, more powerful than that, and there's no guarantee that you ever change anybody's mind that way or that anybody changes their own mind that way, but I'm not sure that there's any examples of people who fundamentally change something that they believe about the world without that situation happening, without that kind of, uh, conflictual relationship, like one where you care about each other, but also, there's a sense of, like, I don't know, the right word is I'm rooting around, and I don't wanna say words like disgust or contempt or something. It's like, being repelled, I think, like, being horrified by what a person you care about is doing is something that, we tend to wanna resolve in some way. Sometimes the relationship ends, sometimes you work through it, sometimes you rethink and change bits about, your own worldview. But I think that's really what we mean by persuasion, and, like, asking yourself if you're a person in their life and if you're willing to, be able to argue, learn their beliefs as well as they can, because if you're gonna really try to persuade somebody, coming at it from a place where, they can legitimately say you don't know what they believe, means that, I don't think that anybody has an obligation to try to convince somebody who dehumanizes them, because that process would mean being able to argue as well as they can that you're, less than a human, and I don't think anybody should do that. I don't think it makes any sense. But if you feel safe, if it's about something that's probably not your own humanity, engaging in something that find abhorrent, and holding that you find it abhorrent while also holding that you care about this person, like, that we can sort of look at that and recognize why that's so powerful and why that's where people's minds change. That's where like people's lives change. And I guess I would also say like my life is a compelling memoir, this experience, because it's so extreme. But I think it's something that's more happens more subtly all the time. Like these are the kind of relationships and conversations that we all have, and I just hope that we kind of step back and look at how important it is when we're doing that, and how challenging it is, and how putting yourself in a situation that you don't know what the outcome is going to be, because you never do, because you can't force anything, you can't demand anything, and just being in that relationship and sort of holding what your values are. Like, I don't think there's any more profound like social experience that we can ever have. And so I just hope people give themselves more credit, because we all end up in these kind of situations and we make choices that I think are, my friends get credit sometimes for the things they said to me, but I think we should all sort of think about the ways that we affect the people around us.
I think that's a beautiful insight. Adrian, I cannot thank you more for taking the time to be here. This recording will be staying on our YouTube page so that anyone who had to miss tonight, and I know there are quite a few that contacted me to say they had to miss and they're very upset. We're going to be keeping this on our website. I do recommend that everybody take a chance to read this book. It is a phenomenal memoir, as you've heard Adrienne speak, and it's great. She's holding it up. Yes, show it off. If you can follow the link in the chat, it will take you directly to the site, the place on Amazon to be able to purchase it. If you can find it in your library, please do. Audiobook, however you can get this information. Adrienne's story is a pretty compelling, as she said, and an original situation that she had gone through herself. So, on behalf of the Jewish Federation, I want to thank Adrienne for being here. The attendees here, thank you all for joining in. Anyone watching this after it happened, thank you as well. Thank you again to our committee, to our literary circle, and to our community for coming together and wanting to stand against hate of all kinds. Have a lovely evening, everyone, and take care of yourselves.